because we haven't had anything like this before. There was people from all over. I mean, we had our friends from Mexico, we had people come from Spain, there was a lot of Brazilians, Colombians, a lot of Guatemalans.
Welcome to the Border Wars podcast. We are the number one podcast in all the Americas, the only podcast that takes you beyond the border. And we are now deep into season 2. If you haven't watched the previous episodes in Spanish, go ahead and subscribe on our YouTube channel, like the video because you will like this video, and then go ahead and share with your colleagues. I have two very special friends and guests, and I could say colleagues now from the Heritage Foundation. But I want to contextualize this. I want to start this conversation a little bit because I'm a big believer in unity of effort. I think is something that we're missing as conservatives. It's something we're certainly missing in Latin America. We're having this kind of authoritarian wave in the Western Hemisphere, and I say Western Hemisphere because we're having some of that here in the United States as well, which these two gentlemen know a lot about. But we're certainly seeing it south of the U.S. border, and I don't think of any radical leftist government that's come into power in Latin America without first dividing the right, splitting them one against another, fracturing. And I think that part of the reason that I think this podcast I think is very special is because the effort that Heritage Foundation has began in conjunction with the Center for Secure Free Society, in conjunction with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, in conjunction with many other institutions, is now to try to fix that, to bring it all back together. So I'm here with, I'm gonna let you guys introduce yourselves a little bit, tell more about your background, but I want to introduce you kind of from things that I read about your bio that I thought interesting. I'm going to start with Simon. So Simon Hankinson, he is a senior research fellow at the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. You have a career in foreign service, 23 years. I see all kinds of cities and capitals from Africa, Asia, no Latin America, but I do notice that you lived at one time in Miami, Florida, so that makes you Latin American specialist by default. And then I also see you're originally from London, England. Is that right? So are you British?
Well, I'm American now.
American. Okay, there you go. So Simon, tell us a little bit about yourself. And as you're telling us about yourself, give us a little bit of your foray into Latin America space. I know it's not your primary focus of work, neither with your career or currently at Heritage, but you've come at it from a specific angle, which I think is very unique and something that's needed more, especially as we're looking at the crisis on the U.S. southern border.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me today. I'm really interested to be talking about this topic. I've had 24 jobs, so I've done a lot of different things. I've driven cabs, I've done construction, I've worked in restaurants, but my first real job was teaching school. I was a lawyer before that, and I taught school in Miami, Florida, like you said. Traveled quite a bit. I've been to Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras for months at a time. So I have weak Spanish, but some appreciation at least of Central America and quite a bit of Mexico. I joined the Foreign Service from Miami in '99. I've served in Africa, Asia, Europe, back here in the States and Washington. And coming to the Heritage Foundation, which has been fantastic for just many reasons. I've been working on immigration, border security, a little bit of diplomacy, and there's a massive overlap between what's going on in Latin America now, the disaster of Venezuela, for example, that's pushed out 7 million people into neighboring countries, and up north, what's happening in the Darien Gap, which used to be this impassable jungle and has now got paths in it apparently, and pretty soon
the Darien Highway now.
Yeah, there'll be a metro stop down there. It really does intersect with what I'm doing. I hate to use the word intersectionality, but what we're doing in the Border Security and Immigration Centers is trying to get a grip on this unprecedented crisis and persuade politicians to take it seriously. On the left, we're having zero success at the moment. I'm afraid to say the Biden administration is locked into this open borders agenda. But I think we've made more headway with getting the attention of people on the right and the center, and just waking up ordinary Americans to the long-term consequences of what's going on in the border, and getting to grips with what's happening in Latin America and these reasons why people are leaving their countries and not trying to build up their own societies, but flee anywhere they can get.
Before I jump to it's something you said right there. I just want to just touch on that a little bit. So you've been looking at Latin America from the perspective of like what's driving this massive amount of immigration that's coming to the U.S. on the border that's overwhelming the capacity. What are you seeing right now? Like what are you learning so far from those, as the Biden administration would call, root causes?
Well, the root causes, I would say, have always been there. You're looking at corruption. Latin America is no stranger to bad government on the left and the right. There have been very few successful sort of democratic administrations, but there have been some. So there's that. There's the population has increased in many places beyond the capacity of the economy to absorb it. There just aren't enough jobs for the people coming out of the job market every year. You've got violence in places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, where they took, I think they have the world's largest petroleum reserves. They just completely tanked the economy through applied socialism, which seems to be the rule. And so with all those factors combining, you add this one extra magic ingredient, which is the Biden administration's open doors. The word is out. People have WhatsApp and Signal and all kinds of ways of finding out that whatever Secretary Mayorkas says, if you try to get into the United States, chances are you'll get to stay and you get to bring your family. So I think, unfortunately, that message has gone out. People are taking risks and crossing. Many are dying, but more are making it through. Yeah.
So in essence, the worse Latin American gets, the harder it becomes for our U.S. southern border, and then the pull factors that are coming from just whatever rhetoric comes out of the administration, but the real incentives that are on the border, whether it's the CPB One app or just anything that has to do with basically let me be careful how I say this, but I think it's essentially providing services to migrants, which, you want to make sure that migrants are taken care of, but at the same time, you got to be careful because you're providing a perverse incentive for more of them to come. And they all know that, and they're all seeing that that's a feasible entryway into the United States. And I travel the region quite a bit. I mean, pretty much every month I'm down there, and this is 100% true. I mean, they know that there's an option where all push comes to shove. If my country goes, to the Venezuelan destructive route, that I can just go up to the U.S. southern border and I could get through. But let me turn to Mike Gonzalez. Mike, I'm gonna say your title, and you're gonna have to correct me if I say it wrong, because I think it's a chaired fellow at the Heritage Foundation, the Angeles D. Arredondo y Pluribus Unum out of many one, Senior Fellow for International Engagement from the Heritage Foundation. You've been at Heritage for quite a while. I think I met you years ago at the Heritage Foundation for 15 years now. But prior to that, you served in the Bush administration as a speechwriter for an SEC commissioner. You're also a speechwriter at the State Department. And then before that, you almost had another career, complete other career as a journalist. And one of the interesting things I saw in your bio that I didn't know prior to today was one of your first overseas, and maybe not if your first overseas assignment to Panama, you got detained and arrested by the Noriega dictatorship during that time. This is obviously before the invasion, but I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about that. That's an interesting anecdote as well.
So I'm still trying to get over the fact that Simon has had 24 jobs. I'm twice his age, and I've had, I think, 6. I just counted them very, very quickly. My first foreign assignment in 1987, I was a cub reporter for Agence France Presse, and they sent me to Panama, and I was there for a month. And the Noriega, this is in 88, a year after I had been at Agence France Presse in Washington, D.C., they arrested me and put me in a prison at Omar Torrijos Airport, where, amazingly enough, they threw me in with a lot of people that had been caught at the U.S. border. Earlier that day, they had failed to pay the coyote or something, and they brought Omar Torrijos was a clearinghouse. They were mostly Bolivians, and they were going to be sent back. So I spent the night with them, talking to them, and then the next morning they expelled me from Panama. They put me on a flight.
But they detained you for what grounds?
So they did not like what I was writing. Even the guy who the magistrate that took me to said, technically, he was honest enough to say, technically, you're here on a businessman's visa. You're not a businessman. That's the technicality.
Okay, yeah.
The reality is we don't like what you're writing.
Okay.
So that made my career. I went back to Washington, and my bosses thought I was hot stuff because I had been arrested and kicked out of my first foreign assignment. And they said, well, where do you want to go now? And I said, well, I looked at what they had to offer, and the office in Hong Kong was pretty busy. And I said it was the editing house for all of Asia, and one would go from Hong Kong and cover stories all over Asia. So I said to myself, I speak Spanish. My last name is Gonzalez. I speak French, passable Portuguese. I'm going to spend my whole career in Latin America. Why don't I just go to Hong Kong, add that to my resume, get some of wild loads. I ended up spending 10 years in Asia.
Oh, wow.
8 years in Europe. And I never, after that, reported from Latin America again. so you never know how life is going to turn out. I like Latin America, though. I like going there. I like the cultures.
Did you grow up in Florida?
No. I grew up in Havana and Madrid.
In Madrid, okay.
And New York.
Okay.
Havana, Madrid. I like to tell people I grew up under Castro, Franco, and Abraham Beam, who was the mayor of New York in the early 70s. And I got to say, New York had me at hello. I loved Queens. Right away, I became one of those obnoxious New Yorkers who did not understand why didn't everybody live in New York? Yeah. I'm no longer that way, but I'm still a Yankee fan and a Giants fan.
There you go.
Some things die hard, and I go to New York. I was just there last week. I go there all the time. I'm very comfortable in New York. I got to say that you said earlier, because what is happening in Latin America interests me greatly, and I see it from the perspective of somebody who cares about my country, the United States, and what happens here. And I think what happens in Latin America never stays in Latin America. It comes here, and not necessarily. A lot of people listening to this will say, "Well, yeah, through immigration and drug trafficking." No, I don't mean it that way. Although obviously that has an impact as well. I mean that there's a very strong nexus between our left and their left, and at this point, at this moment, they're both not just a Marxist left. It's no longer the left we're contending with in this country is no longer the Gephardt, Gephardt's Democratic Party. We're no longer discussing the top marginal tax rate. We're discussing how we're going to be constituted as a country. So the Constitution with a small c and a cap C, and I think that's the same thing in Latin America, in which you also have Marxists who are in power now in practically all the main countries: Brazil, Venezuela, Chile, Argentina, Colombia. And Marxists will be in charge of Guatemala soon. Guatemala may say, "Well, it's a small country, 60 million people." Actually, Guatemala is the Serbia of Central America's Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. Guatemala is
the choke point. Yeah.
But the cultural, it's the cultural base, and the biggest country in Central America. So I see, and as I said, there's that nexus between first you have the Foro de Sao Paulo. I'm sure we're going to get into it later, which is the conference of all the big Marxists, leaders and opposition parties and individuals, groups and NGOs in Latin America. But what people don't realize is that the members of Black Lives Matter and the architects of Black Lives Matter interact with them. They have been invited to For the Sao Paulo group meetings, conferences.
Yeah, they went to Venezuela, I think, even as recently.
Well, I mean, one of them, the one that's most internationally minded, Opal Tometi, traveled to Caracas, and in fact brought Maduro to Harlem, and she also traveled to La Paz, a trip that gets much less attention, and met there with Evo Morales. And I think that's
a key. That's a key. I think 99% of people don't know about that trip.
Nobody knows about that trip. Yeah. Everybody knows about the trip to Caracas because she wrote a manifesto defending Venezuela's direct democracy, participatory democracy, which, as we all know here, it's a sham concept, which is really stands in opposition to representative democracy, and it's a way to get rid of checks and balances. So I like taking a look at all of this and also how it impacts Europe. I am fortunate enough to be able to write at Heritage on all these issues, and which threaten directly our stability here in the United States.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump on one of those points because that trip to La Paz, it's interesting because I don't think people make this correlation between in the United States when we had the BLM riots. I think it was the summer 2020.
Yes,
when they were pretty much destroying capital cities all throughout the country. We saw something very similar to that the year before in Latin America.
Yes,
right. But you don't have a BLM franchise, so to speak, with those letters and acronym in Latin America. You have indigenous movements that have been radicalized very much the same way because the grievance of some population centers in Latin America is the 500 years of struggle from colonial independence and things like that. And that's the biggest talking point that Evo Morales from Bolivia has spoken about time and time again. And so there's a term that they've adopted in Bolivia and they've adopted it throughout Latin America. It's called Abya Yala, right? And Abya Yala, what it means is land of the people, right? And it's actually a Cuna term from the Cuna Indians in Panama. And so in Bolivia, they created the Abya Yala Foundation, which was then funded by the United Nations to basically have Evo Morales not just become the leader of the indigenous movements in Bolivia, but the leader of indigenous movements throughout the Americas, which brought him to Guatemala, to Mexico, and all the other countries that have indigenous leaders. I say that because I think that was the parallel that many people miss, right? Why is that visit from BLM to La Paz, Bolivia so important? Is because they're connecting networks of indigenous movements that have been radicalized from domestic U.S. movements of African Americans that have been radicalized and try to connect them so that, as you mentioned, it will bleed into the United States, the messaging. I don't know if you could touch on that a little bit.
It's, if you talk to the left, the man who recruited and trained BLM founder Patrice Couleurs, his name is Eric Mann, a former member of the Weather Underground, spent time in prison for assault and battery. He recruited her and trained her for 10 years into Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. He actually said in an interview with Venezuela's Telesur, going back to what you're saying, in 2015, he said, look, this is just a little division of labor that we have. Whether it's race or sex or climate, what we try to do is get rid of the United States, get rid of the white settler state. It's oppressive. He calls the United States the most oppressive state in the world. These are people who are, mind-bogglingly crazy. But they're also smart and they do a lot of ill. And so here we have an obsession with race because of our history. We have a lot of bad history with race. Nobody needs to recount it. We all know what it is. In Latin America, they have race, but it's not the black race is Native Americans. Yeah. And so they have a very strong indigenismo. And I think, and this is where you get the push for plurinational states that you had with Morales in Bolivia, with Correa in Ecuador, definitely with Chavez and then Maduro in Venezuela.
No, they try to do this, remember, in Chile as well with the change in the constitution.
The Chileans wouldn't have it.
No, the Chileans actually, they had like a hangover where they had like this huge riot. They basically destroyed their subway station, destroyed a lot of the public institutions. Then they had this constitutional convention to rewrite the constitution and then woke up with a hangover. Like, what are we doing? Like, we don't want to get rid of everything that's been going well in the country. And really what it is, what I think the Chileans realized, and I spoke with a lot of them during this process, was they realized it's a gross violation of the rule of law. Because it's unequal justice. Basically, you have a justice that's applied for one group that's different than it's applied for another group, and that's going to fracture.
It's the Ottoman Empire.
Essentially.
It worked for the Ottoman Empire, if you want to say it worked.
Until it didn't.
But it wouldn't work for us. And I don't think the Ottomans really lived in freedom.
This is true. So I'm gonna jump in. You want to add on something?
No, I was going to say, or it's India. I mean, they only have to look at us to see that this idea of splitting people up into their component parts, and we were talking about 4 groups in the U.S. I think it was some OMB memo in like 1977 that just decided we're going to call everybody who speaks Spanish Hispanic, even though Evo Morales and Ricky Ricardo have absolutely nothing in common except they both speak Spanish, right? And Osama bin Laden is white in that grouping, and he doesn't have a lot in common with Emmanuel Macron. So that stupid structure that we have now sets people up for either scholarships, preferential treatment, or not. And I think mirroring that in any other country would be a huge mistake.
You just reminded me, Sam. I didn't want to make this about this issue, but I mean the Latinx term, right? What do you guys make of that? Because I never really understood it. It translates in Spanish into the worst thing possible, LatinX, and an X in Latin America is like a nobody. It's an X, like whatever, you know. And I was like, who was the brainchild that descended? Like, I got it. We're gonna call them a bunch of nobodies, and said Latinx. I don't know, Mike. If you guys,
I like the left using it because it's so off-putting. It's so offensive to actual Americans of Latin American descent that it actually turns them off and makes them consider conservative policies. Which is what I like.
That's true.
I never discourage the left from using the term Latinx. More of it, please.
It was a unifying term, honestly, because even people that were agnostic or even some moderate leftist Latin Americans were like, what is this? Like
NPR is so dumb. Shh, don't tell NPR. Latinx is a good term, NPR.
There you go.
I mean, I think it's kind of like this, this language that's spread out from the campuses where you call women vagina owners or uterus havers. I mean,
What? I missed that one.
You not heard this?
No.
You don't talk about men and women like you talk about pregnant people,
right.
Testicle havers, vagina owners, womb havers. And you ask any woman and they just look at you like, are you? I mean, my grandmother, my mother, that they'd vote on that. That is insulting to them. So use that language more.
That's crazy. So one of the things, I don't think I've seen you guys since we were all in Miami. I've been traveling a lot and we all have very busy schedules. But not too long ago, we were in Miami, Florida for a very specific purpose. And I want to turn to you, Simon, because you quarterbacked this meeting a lot. And it was basically a meeting of the minds of Latin American conservative leaders from all walks of life, political, business, civil society, think tanks, and also representatives of conservative organizations here in the United States. We called it the inaugural Carvalho Dialogue of the Americas. And we had a statement that was put out. I think you wrote a really good article in National Review, basically outlining a little bit of the conversation that we had in Miami. So the meeting was off the record, so we can't attribute to what people said at the meeting, but we could talk about what the meeting was about. Tell us about how you guys came to this meeting. And for me, and I said this at the meeting, I'll say it right now, public, with all the viewers and listeners, that to me it was like a dream come true because I've been working in Latin America for 15 years. And it's not anyone that's worked in Latin America for a long time knows that all you get is a bunch of infighting. You got this person fighting with that person, that political party talking about that place, and all kind of relatively on the same side. And I felt like an effort to kind of bring everyone together, not that we're going to all agree on everything, and we didn't, but we're going to have some sense of a unifying element to say that we're all kind of fighting the same forces, both here in the United States and in Latin America. Tell us about the Carvalho Dialogue. How did that come about? How do we get to Miami in July?
Sure. I think it was the philosophy that inspired it was one that there were no organizing there were organizing principles, but no organizing body on the conservative side. Whereas the left, and we were just talking about the Foro de Sao Paulo, this Castro Lula da Silva thing where it follows in the heels of the Communist International going right back to the revolution, where it was always about destroying nation states and having one world globalist government. Conservatives tend to, each one runs their own show. Each country has a completely
maximum individualist.
Well, we are individualists by nature. We believe in the individual and then the agency of the individual, but we also share a lot of problems. Our speech is being suppressed. Socialists are trying to take over the economy and get rid of private enterprise. They're letting in China and Iran and Russia in a way that is detrimental to our interests. And so Jim Carafano, who's our vice president over at Heritage, had met with a lot of people from all over the world and many from Latin America who were sort of lamenting that there wasn't any place that we could get together and kind of exchange ideas and collectively fight in favor of our values. So we put together the first conference. We had about 40 people from all over Latin America and the U.S., and we really did find that there was a lot of commonalities, a lot of common ground, and things where we could help each other.
Yeah, I was actually going to invite Jim to the podcast to talk about it, but he's actually, I think, traveling right now. He's traveling. Jim's always traveling. That's Jim. Jim's a man of international work, and so what I took away from the Miami meeting was, among many things, and I'm going to read some of the points that we all had in common that we kind of drafted this statement. But what I really took away from the Miami meeting was this kind of effort, this sense of having a home, right? And Latin Americans are very much like this. They call it el hogar, like just they like to always to go home. They always have a kind of a community sense in terms of their families. And we had this period of time in about a decade or so where some people call it the conservative wave. I don't think that all the presidents were very conservative, but there were right of center presidents that were U.S. friendly that came into power. This is after the pink tide that took place during the first decade of the 21st century. That's when all the Bolivarians, the socialists came into power. So there was a reaction from the Latin American voting public. They said, we're like, Venezuela was already on the decline. They're like, we need to get away from that. They moved in and they voted in, conservative-ish or U.S. friendly, market-friendly presidents. But none of them had a real strategic ally in the United States. Most of them was during the Obama administration, but even during the Trump administration, they might have had an alliance with the Trump White House. But when they came to Washington, they really didn't have a place to go. The Heritage Foundation was there, but they didn't have like an infrastructure. On the think tank side, there's at least 3, maybe 4 full-time think tanks dedicated to Latin America on the left. As you mentioned, the university, the academy is pretty much dominated by leftist professors. So the leftist presidents in Latin America often always had a way to legitimize themselves by civil society and academic networks in the United States. The right of center presidents did not. So I think that my big takeaway was that I think that for political leaders that are going to come into the future, even maybe very soon into the future, thinking about Argentina, they need to have a place in Washington that they can call their home. Like this is our safe space. We're going to come to Washington, D.C. We're not just going to have to talk to X, Y, and Z think tank. We're going to actually be able to go to a place where we're going to talk substantively about what we're facing in our country and know that we're not going to be sabotaged. And that was my main takeaway. I'm going to read some of the points that was drafted in terms of the statement that we collectively all put together. And then I'm going to throw it back to you guys. I'll start with Mike, and then we'll go to Simon. We'll throw it back to you guys, and you just pick out whatever one of those 7 statements or 7 points that we kind of collectively thought were some of the biggest challenges in the region, and then you could just expand on any of them. The first was rising crime, violence, and drug trafficking. I think that's very evident. The second was radical woke U.S. policies. The third was weaponized immigration. The fourth was corrosive foreign influences. That's Russia, China, and Iran. The fifth was persistent corruption. The sixth was silencing dissent. And then the seventh was politicized NGOs, NGOs that are doing more political warfare than anything else. Which one of those caught you guys the most during the conversations in Miami and even just during your work up until today?
Well, they're all so important, it's difficult to pick one or two. But first, I briefly want to say Simon is being very modest. He actually organized a very good meeting.
No, he did.
I didn't realize, I was surprised by how well that meeting went. We had elected leaders there. And I think to just go back very briefly, one of the reasons why conservatives have traditionally not reached out across borders very well is because by nature, conservatives, we are about conserving traditions and norms in religions and philosophies that are very much nation-based, that are people-based. What a conservative in America or Texas wants to conserve is very different from what a Pakistani conservative. But right now we're facing, or Portuguese or a Peruvian conservative, but right now we're facing a common enemy, just as we did during the Cold War. In the Cold War, we were able to gel together under NATO and face the Soviet threat or the Chinese threat. Now we're facing a woke threat that is in many cases, in all cases, I think, is domestic as well as international. So I think to me, that is the most important thing that came up because of you alluded to this before, the fact that the blueprint for our 2020 BLM riots, which was the costliest riots we have ever had in this country and which led to a 30% jump in the murder rate in this country. And even before 2020, between the creation of BLM and 2020, that is 7 years between 13 and 2020, we had an additional 3,000 murders, at least, that happened in cities where BLM rioted or protested because of police pulling back. That's a lot of people who met a very violent end. And as you said, the year prior to 2020, you had in Chile something very similar in 2019, in which protests organized by bots, by social media, most of them coming from Venezuela and Cuba, caused such instability, and the government was not up to it. The government of Piñera was not up to the measure, and of course that caused a great deal of dissatisfaction, and Chileans voted after that for a different leader, a Marxist leader in Boric. So I think that to me was one of the most important things. what was the seven? Can you read me the other six?
Yeah.
There was another one that.
Well, there was rising crime and violence, radical woke use policies, weaponized immigration, corrosive foreign influence, persistent corruption, silencing dissent, and politicized NGOs.
The NGO is also a key thing that you get more in Latin America. Here we don't have NGOs dictating how we live, but we do have a lot of conferences of foreign origin, like the social social economic forum, the social forum, the World Social Forum, Left Roots, Liberation Road, a lot of these groups that have a lot of foreign influence that do destabilize us.
No, where I started really seeing this NGO concept, and I remember when we were discussing the statement, I kind of was putting that in there. It cuts across many levels. It cuts across foreign aid. It cuts across elections.
Right.
But where I saw it, and I think where it impacted me the most, and I want to talk to you, Simon, about this, is on immigration. So I think I said this in the conference, in the Miami meeting, but I have other presentations where I've elaborated on this. I was in Guatemala during the caravans when that began in 2018. It was October 2018.
Yes.
And that was crazy because it went from 180 Hondurans that crossed on October 12th, to 7,000 by October 20th, right? Like, that's not normal. Anyone that's even held a concert or a conference knows it's hard to get 7,000 people at the same place moving in the right direction at the same time. So it was clear that this wasn't organic, although the media had a narrative. All the media, international press went down there, and they're all talking about the poor migrants, the humanitarian concerns, and this bad Guatemalan government that's not enforcing their borders and just like being harsh on the migrants. Well, when I went to look at that, what really caught my attention were the NGOs, because it was let me say that there were some NGOs that were just doing humanitarian work is what they do. But there were some that had political messaging. I mean, they had everything from scripts that they were giving to the migrants and say, memorize this, read this if a camera comes on you, to money that they were giving to some of them, to transportation that they were providing to others. And one of the ones that really caught my attention was the one from Honduras itself. It was called Pueblos Sin Fronteras. And that's a Spanish, for those who don't speak Spanish, it means open borders, basically people without borders. And that NGO, we started to dig really deep into it. And what we found out was they were apolitical because they were created by a political network in the country, network that's now in power inside the country. It's called the Libre Party. Former president, a very defunct former president that got ousted, named Mel Zelaya, was kind of orchestrating, organizing this. But they also received money from Venezuela. Right. And so I think that was the big impetus there, where this was a politicized NGO that wasn't working for humanitarian concerns, was actually taking advantage and manipulating the migrants. They were vulnerable by definition, and using them as sort of weapons to basically create a narrative of open borders from the Honduran Guatemalan border all the way to the U.S. southern border. I want to jump into you, Simon, a little bit, because is that I'm sure that's an area of concern for you and what you're looking at. Or how do you see these NGOs with this open border rhetoric that's been spreading all throughout the Americas?
Well, I think NGOs are doing extremely well out of the open borders. They're making millions of dollars off government contracts. They're not just raising money from do-gooders in the U.S. and elsewhere. They're actually getting billions of federal dollars funneled down through FEMA grants. I mean, I think $108 million went to New York City.
Taxpayer money.
Yeah, there's like $300 million went to various NGOs to house, feed, and transport people off the border. So they bring them in, and I call it a Mayorkas migration machine. It's a giant processing enterprise. Instead of trying to do what they're supposed to do, which is deter illegal aliens from crossing in, detain them if they make it in, and then deport them if they don't qualify for any kind of protection, they bring them in, they process them as fast as possible, send them off to tent cities run by NGOs, and buy them a ticket anywhere they want to go. And I've seen them in airports holding a little piece of paper, and it's an arrest warrant, essentially from INS or DHS now, saying, please show up at court at some point. Some of them just say, please show up to ICE whenever you have a chance. Thanks so much. And they're allowed to travel with this document, this flimsy piece of paper that may not have their correct name. It may not have their correct date of birth. It may not have their correct country of origin. And it certainly doesn't have any clue who they are, what their criminal record is, what their history is. NGOs are doing really well. And the other group that's doing really well, or groups, are the cartels. Yeah. Because the drugs, there are two separate points here, but drugs, crime, and migrants are all intricately connected, because if you want to get through Mexico or the Darien Gap, your chances are you're going to have to pay somebody off. And these cartels, they'll smuggle, they don't care if it'd be gasoline if that was highly taxed, or cigarettes. They're only smuggling drugs because that's what makes them money. And if they can smuggle people and make more money, they'll do that. And so they have done. There are swaths of Mexico. I mean, percentages is probably foolish to try to guess, but swaths of Mexico that AMLO has basically given up to the cartels, just said, yeah, I'm just not going to go there. And they run the place. They control a lot of the borderlands, and they get to decide who goes through, and they get their cut.
No, that's an important point, because initially, when this caravan thing happened in 2018, the cartels didn't like it initially, because it was putting too much spotlight on the border, and they were trying to be clandestine and move their drugs very low profile. But then they adapted, and they figured it out that, wow, there's a whole nother market here that we could tap into, which is human smuggling. And then, the cousin of human smuggling, which is human trafficking, which is an economic crime that's on the border, sex trafficking and others. But they allowed them to diversify the revenue stream. And human smuggling has become a booming business. In the defense lexicon, we call this human smuggling facilitators, which are basically middlemen that oftentimes are often travel agencies that essentially work with the drug cartel, work with the tourism industry, and work with local governments to essentially arrange the movement of mass amounts of people from one destination to another destination. That's why people are asking me a lot of times, like, why is Cancun all of a sudden become this huge violent area when it's, Cancun, right? Spring break, right? I was like, because of the tourism industry in Cancun got in bed with the drug cartels for human smuggling. And all of a sudden now you have all kinds of illicit enterprise taking over what used to be the popular spring break destination for most U.S. college students. And I think that there's a lot of things here that we can plug away. But if I were to ask you something, I haven't seen Latin America as bad as I've seen it today. I just came back from a couple countries in South America. And each country I get a little bit more alarmed at how bad things are going. We just had a political assassination of a presidential candidate in one country in Ecuador. We're having another country where essentially they are figuring out how to fracture their civil society into like 10,000 different pieces. And then you have the dictatorships of the region, which is multiplying. We just used to have Cuba back in the day in the Cold War. Now we have Venezuela. Now we have Nicaragua. We argue Bolivia. But what would you say is the point to the one thing? And I'm going to go to Mike first with this. What is the worst thing that you're seeing in Latin America? And do you share this diagnosis that you've been around much longer than I have. Have you seen it this bad before?
Well, it's different. Before 1990, before the creation of the Foro de Sao Paulo, you had Marxism with bullets. You had Castro, who really is Cuba as the snakehead of this whole pushing Marxism in Latin America, creating all these terrorist groups and the Montoneros, the Tupac Amaros, in South America. Che Guevara famously dies in Bolivia, and then you have Castro funneling money and arms to the Farabundo Martí in El Salvador and to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But they all fail. They all fail to gain power. Cuba is the only place in Latin America where Marxist communists have taken over with guns. And then in 1990, the penny drops. Lula reads Gramsci. He realizes all of a sudden we can get elected. All we have to do is hide the fact that we're Marxists and run as the anti-graft, anti-corruption candidate, as the populist, as the reformist. Somebody's going to reform. And then once you get in, you try to get a majority in the Congress, and then you reform the Constitution. You have called Constitutional Assembly. You change the nature of the country, and then that's it. You get rid of checks and balances, and it's very difficult to get rid of these Marxist leaders. Bolivia tried with getting rid of Evo Morales for a while, but we have Arce, who's really a proxy. Yeah. And I think I don't know what's going to happen in Ecuador, but I don't think it augurs well. And then
you were talking about Arevalo before. Why don't you expand a little bit on Guatemala, because that was one still.
It's the same thing. I mean, he Arevalo, the conservative. First of all, the conservative candidate who would have won was disqualified. We still don't really understand how that happened. And then the conservative vote was really dispersed. Yeah. And you had
they disqualified 3 candidates, I believe, right?
Yeah. And then you had Arevalo, the man who eventually won. So he made it past the first round in June, but the first round he made it with the lowest amount of support of any candidate in Guatemalan history, 11%. 11% voted for him in the first round, but he was the second highest vote getter. The first one was Torres, Sandra Torres, who really does have a ceiling of like 40%. She's lost now 3 times. Yeah. She got 37%, I think, this time. Arevalo really ran the clock. He beat her by 20 points in the second round, and he presented himself as the anti-corruption reformer, the same way that Chavez was instructed to do so when he ran in '98.
That's a good point.
The same way that Morales ran when he ran, I think, 2005, right, in Bolivia.
Yeah, correct.
Correa in Ecuador. This is the first pink wave. Yeah. They all did the same thing. It's the same model. They've been advised by the same Spanish consultants, the same academic consultants who are still advising. There's an organization based in Quito, which was founded by communist academic consultants from Spain, and I don't know whether they advised. You and I kind of looked at it, whether they were advising Arevalo or not, but they were certainly very praiseful of Arevalo. They were very supportive of Arevalo, CELAC was, and they definitely advised Petro.
Yeah.
They advised Petro, and one of the founders of CELAC, Monedero, Juan Carlos Monedero, was with them the whole day, the day of the election, in June of 2022, right? The day of the election was June 19th, 2022, I believe. And he was with them when he won, finally, in the stadium in Bogota. So the connection here is very strongly. They have very good consultants who convince them, and they're no longer winning with bullets, they're winning with ballots. Yeah. Let's be clear about this. They're being elected. Yeah. They're being elected.
At least once.
Yeah. But in fraudulent, you can say, it's a fraudulent election because they're not really running as who they are. They asked Petro, are you still a Marxist? And El País did, this Spanish newspaper, and he gave an answer, which even El País, which is a socialist paper, said it was a scurrilous answer, because he said, well, many things have happened since I called myself a Marxist. Now I don't believe in bullets anymore. Of course he doesn't, because he realized ballots will get him there. He was a guerrilla. He was a terrorist. He was a member of M19, a terrorist Marxist group. He epitomizes this idea that you no longer have to be a terrorist. You can get elected. We have somebody like that here in the United States. In the United States, his name is Bill Ayers. Yeah. Bill Ayers was a terrorist with the weather on the ground, the husband of a terrorist, Bernardine Dorn. The weather on the ground did not achieve what he wanted to achieve. So what did Bill Ayers do when he comes out from underground in 1990? He gets a PhD in education. He's now seen as an educational reformer. Yeah. As Sol Stern said, to call Bill Ayers an educational reformer is like calling Stalin an agricultural reformer. Yeah. But so we have our Gustavo Petro is Bill Ayers, who introduces Barack Obama to the political world in the late 90s in Chicago.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things that you said there, Mike, particularly with Petro, but kind of this process, right? So some people call this authoritarian learning, right? They kind of learn from one another, right, and they start to apply the same tactics and protocols to be able to, win one time and then change the rules and then figure out how to perpetuate into power. But I think one of the things that we're starting to see now, there are the classic dictatorships, the Ortegas in Nicaragua, the Castros now, Diaz-Canel in Cuba that are the longest one in Maduro. But we're seeing now this element where conflict seems to be the order of the day. It's not just about perpetuating into power. It's about pushing forth more, you call it revolution, that's their term, but you really just pushing forth transformation, a fundamental transformation. I just came back from Colombia. One of the things that struck me about that was, Petro's been a disaster, right? In 1 year, his popularity went from he got elected to he's sloping down that public opinion polls very rapidly. But then the question is, and we saw this with Pedro Castillo in Peru, and the question is this because they're incredibly incompetent, but then they still win at some point, right? Or is this because they're actually now being used as kind of puppets to be able to create all kinds of elements of change? And so I'll make the argument on Castillo, and then I'll get your reaction. So Castillo obviously was incompetent. That's without a doubt. He was a union leader. He was never a political leader. He never governed. He never did anything really in terms of actually being in charge of something that has to produce results. But in essence, I always argued that he accomplished his goal. And maybe not his goal per se, but the goal of the people that put him into power in the first place. Because he was another one that came out of nowhere. No one really knew who he was, and all of a sudden he's the president of the country. But what did he accomplish? He accomplished more increased polarization between the North and the South. He accomplished the unifying of the Southern indigenous separatist movements of the country. he accomplished a radical, basically, kind of a radical rhetoric that's being starting to take over inside the country. And now he's accomplished getting certain elements of the right to align with certain elements of the left against what they call in Peru the caviares, which are the establishment, the elites of the country. And the result of that is the potential fracturing of civil conflict in Peru. Either go as bad of a civil war, I don't know if it's going to go that bad, but there's elements now they're talking about the country fracturing into different wars. Let's just get your reaction.
Well, because the left thrives on grievances.
Yeah.
The left, it's still really Karl Marx's playbook of having a dialectic, an opposition between classes, an oppressive class and an oppressor class. And in Karl Marx's day, he presented his economic classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That didn't work because the worker really wanted to improve his condition on the factory floor. He did not want revolution. The German communists and the Italian communists understood this in the 1920s, and they very quickly switched to race, which is immutable. You can change your socioeconomic status, and one does in capitalism. I have gone myself, I've changed my socioeconomic status many times in my life. But one thing you cannot change, things you cannot change, are your race, your national origin, and get ready for this one, you cannot change your sex.
Your gender.
So these are immutable characteristics. If you're looking for a revolutionary agency, it's better to place it in immutable characteristics than on social classes.
So let me pivot back to Simon a little bit. So we have the kind of cultural phenomenon that's happening. And I would say that we are also seeing a wake up in Latin America. And this, I think, was representative in the Miami meeting, which there's certain elements of Latin America that are now taking that cultural battle on themselves, right? And we had some of those individuals that were represented in Miami. Well, let me push back. Let me pivot to you, Simon, about the border again, because I think so. One of the things that me and you have discussed a lot about is, the problems that are happening at the U.S. southern border obviously extend beyond the border. And the first country in there is Mexico. And AMLO, has been looked at for some as kind of a leader inside Mexico, political leader, president, moving into election. But I've always looked at him as a node within a network, because AMLO has tried, much like many other candidates, tried to win presidency many times, lost many times, third time's the charm. He finally got it through. But he was only enabled to win by aligning himself with his network, because had that network abandoned him or distanced himself from them, he probably would never become president in the first place. Is that something that you're now taking away from the work that you're doing now that AMLO Mexico is now part of this bigger project that's happening throughout the region? It's not just U.S.-Mexico relations in its traditional sense.
Well, it strikes me, and I'm nowhere near the expert on Latin America that you guys are. I learned a lot at the conference. I'm learning more today. But it strikes me that as a historian with a general grasp of the way things work, that the future of the United States seems to be Latin America instead of the other way around. We always used to think, well, there's progress. These countries are going to develop. They're going to get democracy. They're going to get everything we have.
They're going to look more like the U.S.
Look more like us. And what's actually happening is the exact opposite. We're getting censorship. We're getting socialism. We're getting authoritarianism. We're getting inflation, right? And that thing you described, the phenomenon where you win one election, then change the rules so you keep power, arguably, and I'm not saying that either side is free of this, but all of the gerrymandering and the vote, the idea of that any attempt to make sure that people have an ID to vote and that they can't be preached to while they're in line is considered to be fascist. You're preventing minorities from voting. That's very much part of that playbook. We win an election and then we're locked in forever. There was a book came out in like 2004 called, the Coming Permanent Democratic Majority. I forget the exact title, but the philosophy was everybody who comes in from Latin America in particular is going to vote Democrat. So eventually this country will be a coalition of interest groups. It'll be the blacks, the Hispanics, and whatever, liberal women. I forgot what the exact combination was. And then we'll never lose an election again. Well, it turns out not to be that easy, because you can't put all the Hispanics in one bucket and assume they're going to do one thing. They have their own interests and divergent opinions as well. But that was the idea. So this open borders that we have now is part of that whole philosophy. It's part of the globalist philosophy that there shouldn't be nations, there shouldn't be borders. You shouldn't be able to tell someone that they can't. Property is theft, right? Yeah. Anybody could come and live anywhere they want. So unfortunately, this phenomenon that maybe, I wouldn't say it started in Latin America, but it certainly caught fire there in various places, including Cuba, probably at the extreme, is coming home to us.
That's a great point. And I think I never really looked at it that way, right? But for decades, the U.S. foreign policy on Latin America has been a one of emulation, right? Look at how good things are in the United States. If you adopt these democratic principles or advocate on human rights or just whatever policies we would push forward, then you will become more like us. And it's somehow backfired to where we're starting to like reform ourselves to become more in line with some of the banana republic politics that have happened over centuries inside Latin America. And that's interesting because Latin Americans are seeing that, and they saw things, even the way we've handled our elections. They've seen the way we've handled censorship in this country. They've seen, they're seeing what's going on with President Trump today, and they're like, oh, we know that. We've seen that before. Yeah. That's very familiar. You know, you lock up a political candidate, or you basically shut somebody off from the media or from the press. And so what I worry about is I feel like they're starting to lose respect for the United States. And I don't mean it from a kind of like a superficial respect, but almost like a fear. And why I say that, because, you know, my parents are immigrants. I think the thing that people sometimes overlook about why people come to the United States, and I'll say this from Latin America, I can't say the whole world, but I know from the Latin American perspective, it wasn't always just jobs and opportunities. That's always a part of it. But it's really this sense of order, law and order, because you can find jobs and opportunities. You can work for a cartel as a job, as an opportunity, but you don't always get a fair shake, and you definitely won't get one with the cartel. And so they always had this notion that if I come to the United States, it doesn't matter my surname, it doesn't matter my economic background, it doesn't matter what part of the country I live, I always have at least a chance to do something better. But they're starting to lose that, and then they're starting to think that the United States, I've heard this many times, it's like, oh, you guys are just as corrupt as we are, maybe worse, you know? So that symbolism of, you know, the shiny city on the hill, I think that is something that's allowed the United States to become this kind of great example and hope for the world. That's starting to change. What would you attribute that to? Is that just bad U.S. policies? Is that foreign influences that are coming and corroding our mentality? How do you see this?
I think it's entirely man-made. Man is a sinner. We're all the same. There's no more corruption in the hearts of Latin Americans or Africans than there is in Englishmen or Frenchmen. If you go back to England in the 18th century, it was horribly corrupt. Yeah. I mean, they had, parliamentary boroughs where there's like one person living in it. But over time, you had middle classes in particular reach a certain level of prosperity, and they said, we don't want to put up with this. We want this to be a fair, freer society. So that has happened in the past, but it doesn't mean that it can't be undone. Yeah. And I think what's happened is that we have undermined ourselves, and I don't mean everybody, but our institutions are no longer trusted the way they used to be. There was a sense when I was growing up that the FBI would always get their man. They would pursue the truth up until, it didn't matter where it went. They would follow the path to justice. Nowadays, I don't think a lot of people feel that way. I mean, there's some great people in the FBI. I've worked with them, but the Department of Justice, the reputation has been really tarnished by the selective way that they've gone after people on the right, and they've left people on the left alone, essentially for political reasons, because they want to get promoted and collect their pensions and go on to gigs on NBC or whatever.
Yes, let me strike a positive note. The book that Simon references, The Coming Democratic Majority, 2002, by John Judas and Rui Teixeira. Rui Teixeira has recanted, so has John Judas, a lot of what they wrote, but really they couldn't have foreseen what happened. Now he left the Center for American Progress, a very lefty think tank in DC, couldn't stand it there anymore. I went to American Enterprise Institute last year. I had lunch with Rui at AEI about 6 months ago. I had lunch with him at Heritage more recently, and one thing he said to me is that what he couldn't have foreseen was how the left was going to go berserk with race and sex and gender and say things and embrace positions that were going to be truly offensive to voters of Latin American descent. And this is perhaps how you get 40% of so-called Hispanics voting for Trump. How you get? I saw an opinion poll today that Biden has a support of 37% of Hispanics, which is historically low. The Republicans are just a little bit below him, so it doesn't really augur very well for him. And so that ties in with the wokeness that we have been talking about. But I am very optimistic about this country for that reason exactly. The American people have also woken up to this. I travel the country extensively. In 2021, I visited 30 cities. Last year, I visited fewer cities. In 2022, I went to only 24 cities. This year, in 23, I've gone to much fewer cities. I expect to travel again next year. I've been writing a book this year, so I stayed home more. I think the American people have woken up to this, and this is why you have the resistance to critical race theory, to gender theory, to all these radical agendas that the left has bizarrely embraced. And so I think that I'm very optimistic that America has woken up and is not going to put up with this any longer.
No, I think I agree, and I see the same in Latin America. I think there's a wake up that's happening in Latin America, because if we are very, if we're getting pushed past the envelope on these issues such as gender and race and sex, Latin America is much more traditionalist than we are on those issues specifically. They don't like messing with their kids on these issues. I certainly see the agendas being pushed in certain countries, but I don't see the embrace. I actually see the embrace bigger here in the United States than I did down in Latin America. But then I also see the pushback that you're talking about from many communities. I remember the Armenians in California that were basically, they said, no, we're not going to do it in our neighborhood.
Salvadorans in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I see that happening. So I want to start wrap this a little bit to end on a bit of an optimistic note. I think in the meeting in Miami, we had some signs of optimism, right? We had some of the participants talked about faith-based networks and how they're starting to coalesce and bring together movements and networks that are pushing forth a more traditionalist message. We also had some countries that were represented that, looking to gain political power once again. Colombia has regional elections this year in October, and that's, local mayors, governors, things like that. Petro's been very unpopular. He's been a disaster. He has scandal after scandal. There's a Hunter Biden situation down in Colombia with Nicolas Petro. So he's
written about it.
Yeah, he did. He did a nice in the National Review article. It actually kicks off with makes you kind of like a teaser, but it makes you think you're talking about Hunter Biden. And he's like, no, I'm talking about Nicolas Petro, and it's very similar.
Very sneaky of you.
Yeah, it was a good intro, and but there are signs of optimism. I want to push back to you guys and say, what do you see? Signs of optimism, either something we talked about in Miami, or do you see it somewhere else, and maybe that in your own work that you're looking at in Latin America? Obviously, I'll have my vote of optimism in Latin America, and I'll talk about it at the end. But Simon, what are you seeing any rays of hope inside the Western Hemisphere, inside Latin America, that would be important for the United States?
Well, I remember one session that we had that covered Peru. And it was, I don't remember the Spanish translation, but it was essentially, don't touch our kids. And it was a bunch of just regular people who probably work, more than 9 to 5 jobs, are not rich, just struggling to make ends meet, who'd finally realized, had woken up, talk about woke, to this gender ideology and what it really meant. And I run into people all the time who are highly educated, who absolutely have no idea the extremes of things like critical race theory and gender theory and, anything with a capital T theory. So the best remedy for leftism is try it. See what happens. And every time you find it ruins economies and it ruins societies. So I hope we don't have to go the Cuba route where we've got to live with it for, 50 years before people get annoyed enough to, maybe one day overthrow it. But in this one Peruvian example, you saw what you see in neighborhoods in Loudoun County and in California and parts of the States where parents get organized, they get mad, they say, no, we do not want this ideology foisted on us. You can't teach our third grade kids about deviant sexual practices and gender ideology until they're in grad school and we're not paying for it. So that Peruvian example was a real
I remember the video. Yeah. It was called No te metes con mis niños, o mis hijos, no te metes con mis hijos. That was a good, powerful video. And that campaign's working. It's still active. And I think they're going to replicate it in other countries in Latin America. Like, don't mess with my kids. So that was a good one. Mike, you got a sign of hope?
Well, let's see what happens with Milei in Argentina.
I
mean, he reminds people of Trump in many, many, many ways, including the crazy hair.
Yeah. He does. He does have crazy. He was like a Rolling Stones rock band or something. He was like Contra or something. He was like very.
I tell you, if Argentina goes with Milei, that kind of conservatism, Katie barred the door.
Yeah, Argentina is not a small country. That's
not a small country.
That is a powerhouse. Right. They were a powerhouse many years ago.
It was 100 years ago. People didn't know which was going to be the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, and then they went the populist big government route and shot themselves in the foot and the head and everywhere else.
And shot some other people too.
Yeah.
So you stole mine. I'm actually bullish about Argentina. You probably see my email traffic. I'm very bullish about Argentina because I was never optimistic about Guatemala because I saw themselves shooting each other in the foot. I mean, the loss of that election didn't happen the night before election. It happened months in advance. When, as you mentioned, Mike, they were disqualifying candidates left and right, looking for any reason. Definitely not optimistic about Ecuador. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. A little surprise note in the bow. I didn't expect that, but I just came back from that country. That country's they got 14,000 different micro cartels.
And you knew Vicencio.
I did know. I knew Fernando. We crossed paths.
This is such a loss.
Yeah, let me tell you a little about Fernando because it was interesting. He is not a politician. He's not even really a journalist. Some people catch him as a journalist. He was actually a sindicalista, which is like a union leader. He comes from the left. He's an environmentalist as well. He comes from indigenous networks. But when Rafael Correa became president in 2007, he started seeing this guy came with the message of anti-graft and all this other stuff, as you were mentioning. And then he did the complete exact opposite. He increased corruption. He attacked he was an environmentalist, but then he's signing deals with China that's basically destroying all the indigenous communities. So he got really upset, and he turned all that energy that had been used for like this militant left causes against Correa. And then Correa put the hammer on him, and they first persecuted him for defamation because he wrote about his cousin in these corruption scandals. And then he wrote about the China corrupt deals between PetroChina and PetroEcuador. And then that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was actually $5 billion worth of corruption that actually ended up with the Odebrecht case and his vice president in jail. And then for that one, he had to leave the country. He left to Peru. He was living there in exile. And then when Correa left in 2017, he came back. And so he's always been under some sense of threat. But I think that things are changing. And the message to me with the assassination of Vicencio is that it's not safe to run for. I mean, if you're going to run to try to change the system, you're going to do it at high risk. And I think this wasn't just a message to Ecuador. This is a message to Colombia, to Argentina. So I am optimistic about Argentina, and I'll say real quick why. Two reasons. One, because they have great topsoil. So I feel like if the world goes
fantastic topsoil,
they have fantastic topsoil. Like, and really at the end of the day, if you can't feed yourself, then you're going to be in trouble. But if you have the soil, so that's one. But the other is because, interestingly enough, Peronism is so difficult to control that I don't feel like the Kirchneristas were ever able to ever really control Peronism. So the Kirchneristas tried to branch off and become a version of radical leftist Peronism, and it didn't really work. She did create a following, but not strong enough to permanently control the country like they've done in Cuba, Venezuela, and other places. And the alignment that you're seeing with Milei, who's a libertarian candidate, but with other conservative networks. And he said something very smart early in his campaign. He said, because he got criticized by a lot of libertarian friends because when he endorsed Bolsonaro and Vox from Spain, and a lot of his more libertarian friends were saying, well, like Milei, those are fascists, they're ultra-right and things like that. And he said, listen, who are they against? He said, they're against the socialists. If they're against the socialists, they're with me. And I was like, that guy's smart. Yeah, because the unity that country needs, they don't have a millimeter of sunlight that they have to distance themselves if you're in the right of center networks. And I think he understood that. And actually him and Bullrich have had conversations. So if I feel like either one, like I said, they both moved to the second round. If Milei were to win the presidency, I see a scenario where he's going to tap into Bullrich's people for different ministries, such as the defense and intelligence security ministries, where he doesn't really have that expertise. His vice president is very solid, by the way, Victoria Villarreal. She comes from a security background. Because people, they take it like a joke. He's a real economist. He's a serious economist. He understands why the country's going through one of the worst inflations in the entire region. And I feel bullish about it and if Argentina wins, if they flip, as Mike was mentioning, this is not just, I'm not going to pick on Haiti, but it's not Haiti or some other small country in Latin America. This is a major powerhouse, and we lost that opportunity with Brazil. Right? We had a great opportunity with Brazil. We had President Bolsonaro. Whatever people think about President Bolsonaro, he signed more agreements with the United States in one day than the previous 4 presidents combined. He was a great friend of the United States, still is a great friend of the United States, but unfortunately that country took a pivot 180 turn against. So I'm hoping Argentina flips. If Argentina flips, we have 2025 Chile. Then 2026 is a repeat of 2021, I think, or 2022, Colombia, Peru, and all those countries. And so we can actually have it, but it also has to begin here at home. And I'm looking forward to 2024 in the United States because, we're having our own kind of radical leftist agenda. We'll
see how the primaries go.
We'll see how the primaries go. And we have this kind of thing here happening in the U.S. And actually, what I'm going to take away from here is actually, I think what you said, Simon, which was that, we forever thought that we were going to be able to be the example for Latin Americans to follow. And it looks like it went the other way around. So I think that's really and that's a good way to put it, kind of like a mirror image. But any last thoughts or anything? And before we close out the podcast?
No, not really. No, I'm good. I think that your closing thoughts were very good.
Yeah. Simon?
It's just great to have somebody younger than me and someone just a tad older than me both be optimistic, because that's my weak suit. So don't bet against America.
A tad older than him.
No, but I mean, so let me end it with this, because I think, for those that don't know, I'm also now a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So I'm working with Mike, with Simon on various other projects, some that haven't been announced yet. But this meeting that we had in Miami, I thought it was a very special meeting. And Simon, you are being very modest, because there's a lot of logistics and coordination that go into these things, and it's not easy to get.
Well, that meeting could have gone very badly.
No, I've been at meetings. It's hard to get a bunch of Latin Americans or Latins to get in the room together and to be on time and punctual, and we did it. And
they were all your connections, so thank you for that.
Yeah, but even if I try to organize them, they all come late and things like that. So, but no, I thought that went well. I thought it was an amazing meeting. We're supposed to have another one in Texas in the near future, and the idea is to make it an annual thing, right? To have an annual meeting ground where we're going to have two candidates, we have two groupings of U.S. and Latin Americans come together, work out the linguistic differences, but in the end, and I think the commonality that we have was very exemplified. So I thank you guys. It's an honor for me to be colleagues with you guys at Heritage, to keep pushing this kind of these networks forward, to allow them to have the power that they need to be able to come into permanent states of presence inside Latin America. So if you're new to the podcast, be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you like this podcast, like the video, share it with your friends and colleagues. This is the season 2 of the Border Wars podcast. We're going to have other episodes that are going to come out in the near future. Let me thank Mike Gonzalez and Simon Hankinson for being with us. We're going to have other senior fellows from the Heritage Foundation, as well as other leadership of the Heritage Foundation, come on to the podcast in the near future. And you're going to start to hear more about this. There's other organizations that are involved as well. I mentioned the Texas Public Policy Foundation. That's a great group based out of Austin, Texas, but there's others in Latin America and even in Spain. Actually, I want to, at some point, Mike, well, maybe just right now, real quick, I'm getting a call from Simon's driver. He's like, the limo is waiting for you, sir. But just real quick on Spain, because...
But one thing that you did say that I wanted to add, how Milei embraced Vox. If only some Spanish conservatives had that foresight to embrace Vox instead of maligning it and demonizing Vox as they did during the election, and that's one of the reasons why they come up short by 4 seats of an outright majority, and they're having now the king has just appointed the leader of the Partido Popular to try to form a government. We'll see if he's able to. He's going to have great difficulties doing that. If they had the foresight that Milei had of embracing Vox, things could have gone very differently.
Yeah, that's true. Spain was a bit of a heartbreak, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, guys, see you guys at the next one.
Bye.
Subscribe to the Border Wars podcast and visit our website at securefreesociety.org. See you in the next episode.